Penny left work very late. Like every night, she drove her car along the deserted road back home. That day she was very tired, and the road was long, so she decided to stop at a service station to fill up the gas tank and stretch her legs, and have a coffee while she was at it. She didn't want to fall asleep at the wheel. After a few minutes, she decided to resume her journey. But soon she saw through the rearview mirror how a car was behind her and made signs with its lights, turning them on and off. Penny was terrified. She didn't recognize the car's license plate, so she decided to speed up. The car behind, far from giving up, increased its speed and began to intermittently put on its high beams. Penny kept speeding up. She was on a traffic road. There were no houses and no one to call for help. Suddenly, the car behind came so close that it hit her rear bumper. The young woman didn't understand anything. She didn't know if he was someone who had drunk too much and didn't know what he was doing, or if he was someone dangerous who wanted to hurt her. She kept accelerating, trying to gain an advantage with the car behind, until finally, and with her heart about to explode, she managed to enter the city roads. There was much more light there, and with the curve, she managed to leave her pursuer behind. When she managed to get home, she ran out of the car to get to the door as quickly as possible. Upon entering, she locked the door and looked out the window. She couldn't believe it. The car that was chasing her parked right behind hers. He had followed her home. A short, frightened man got out of the car and, looking out the window, yelled at her, "Don't open the door. Call the police." Penny didn't understand anything. Why was this man who had chased her telling her to call the police? Suddenly, a man in a long trench coat and carrying an axe got out of her own car. With a firm step, he lunged at the driver who was chasing her and dismembered him in a matter of seconds. Penny couldn't contain her screams of hysteria. That driver who was chasing her, the only thing he wanted was to warn the woman that there was someone in her back seat. At the gas station, he had seen how the killer had broken into the woman's car while she was buying her coffee. The next day, the police found Penny's body in her house with broken window panes. Despite all the investigations, the killer in the back seat was never identified.
It was the year 1996, and the television commercials showed the recent Nintendo 64 with its flagship game, Mario 64. Bob, 35 years old, was a lover of video game consoles. It was his passion since he was a child. He couldn't wait to get his hands on the new release, even though the console hadn't even gone on sale in stores yet. However, this night could be very special. In his city, a television program had organized an event in which a Nintendo 64 with the Mario game would be raffled. It was one of the few consoles that the company had distributed to various sectors to create expectation for future customers. Bob had registered online and had managed to participate in the event. He arrived at the chain's facilities 2 hours early, and he wasn't the only one, because there was a large group of children and teenagers at the door. During the wait, he felt somewhat irritated and indignant at the reaction of the other participants. Almost everyone looked at him as if they were facing an alien. "Aren't you too old for this?" a boy of 15 or 16 dared to say to him. "At your age, I would already have children and a wife," he heard another whisper behind his back. Bob just bit his tongue so as not to risk being expelled before entering. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the moment you were waiting for has finally arrived, said the presenter opening his program. After which, a contest began in which the ability and knowledge that the participants had in relation to various games were tested. Finally, after a tough competition, there were 5 finalists, among whom was Bob and the daughter of the show's producer. A girl of about 14, red-headed and chubby, with big horn-rimmed glasses. Bob didn't know who her father was, that he had rigged almost everything for her to win. In the last part of the contest, there were 5 sections and the participants had to choose one at random. Behind each block, there was always a prize. And that's when Bob noticed that the presenter always showed a number from 1 to 5 with his right hand to the red-haired girl. She was doing it downwards, and his movements seemed somewhat spontaneous, but it hadn't gone unnoticed by Bob, who realized that he was telling the girl what theme to choose. When the girl won, Bob lost control and said everything he saw out loud. The audience was silent, looking at him, but they all laughed out loud when the presenter told him in a fake joking tone, "Come on, man, it's just a game. You will have the opportunity to buy your own console later. I'm sure you can buy it yourself and you won't have to ask your parents for it." Bob got even angrier with those words, so the presenter approached him, turning his back to the audience and covering his microphone, said, "Hey, I think you're right. You deserved that console, but I have another one. Don't worry. I just have to ask them to bring it to me, so wait for me outside and I'll bring it to you." Patiently, Bob waited in the street until 11:30 p.m. It was already very late and he saw that they were closing all the facilities. So he approached the gate guard and told him what happened on the show. The man told him he was sorry, but he could not let him in. Just at that moment, the presenter with other guards passed by the side of the door. Bob shouted at him from the door, claiming the promised prize. However, he sneered at him and said that he was impressed that he had fallen for such a simple lie and trap. Bob realized that the presenter had only told him this to keep him off the set and avoid a scandal on air. He lost control and began to insult him, but the presenter ordered his guards to take him away from there and threatened him with a severe beating if he dared to appear there again. For a long time, no one ever heard from Bob again until they hosted a costume contest on the same show. Taking advantage of the occasion to remind the presenter what made him suffer the night of the contest, Bob dressed up as Mario. However, his suit was torn and covered in blood and dirt. He had also painted his face, simulating bruises and wounds. During the program, at a time when the presenter was speaking, Bob stood behind him, putting him in a very uncomfortable situation. Since the show was broadcasted live, the presenter pretended to be in a good mood and said, "Look, our friend Mario seems to be very excited about our costume contest. Let's see, Mr. Plumber, tell us what encourages you to get in front of the cameras tonight." Bob was silent for a few seconds, causing the presenter more discomfort, and then, in a soft voice, he said, "Tonight, I'm going to kill you and your family." In that instant, he recognized the man's voice and goosebumps rose. The presenter was going to use the humorous tone, as he always did, to make the audience laugh at Bob's words. But suddenly, all the lights inexplicably went out for 10 seconds, and when everything lit up again, Bob was no longer there. Frightened by the threats, the presenter asked some guards to go to his house to check that his family was okay. Arriving home, he greeted his daughter with a kiss on the forehead. The young woman who had seen the program was worried, but her father assured her that no one would harm her. He had hired a couple of chained guards to watch the house that night. A couple of hours after he fell asleep, the presenter woke up agitated when he heard a loud noise. When he entered the room, he couldn't believe it. The furniture and the television were smashed, the guards were dead, and on the wall was written in blood in large letters, "It's me, Mario." Those were the words that the character said in the Mario 64 game. The man rubbed his eyes, trying to believe that it was all a dream, but everything was the same. Face pale, he ran back to his room. In his bed was the head of his wife and the body was on the floor. The presenter was crying and screaming on his knees with his face in his hands. Unfortunately, the worst part of the nightmare was yet to come. "Dad!" his daughter yelled. The man ran to the girl's room and found her dying on the floor with her chest open and the Nintendo 64 embedded. Next to her was Bob in his bloody Mario costume, carrying a huge dagger. In those moments, terror outweighed anger, and the presenter ran. People say that Bob chased him into a ravine and that the presenter fell there, breaking his leg and finally being killed by his pursuer. The last that was heard of Bob was that the police entered his house and found a Nintendo 64 turned on, and a Mario that inexplicably returned to die on the screen over and over again with a background melody.
A 3-story hotel. It was never full, but never empty. Its rooms were not luxurious, and it did not have the best location. In fact, it was right next to a national highway. That was good for business travelers, but terrible for leisure travelers. They kept hearing cars passing by all night long. I chose it for the food. That was the only thing that stood out about the place. All the Google reviews agreed that they offered homemade food at a very affordable price. And to tell the truth, I was also attracted to the price. It wasn't too expensive for being next to the city. I needed to spend a few days in the area because I was writing my new book and I wanted to go to different places, to get out of my comfort zone so the ideas would come to me. It usually worked for me, but I had been sleeping badly for months, so I wasn't sure it would this time. I caught a plane and then a cab. There was no other way to get to the hotel. It was clear that it was geared to clients arriving by road. Otherwise, it was impossible to stay there. As soon as I got out of the cab, I was surprised at how beautiful the exterior facade was. It was spotless and lacked no detail. There were flowers adorning every corner, and the windows were spotlessly clean. I didn't expect that. I thought I would find a typical roadside bar, useful but improvable. I went in happy for what I had found outside and went to the reception. There was a young woman there who, according to my calculations, was not much older than 18. She was perfectly uniformed and at first spoke to me in perfect English. I told her I was from Spain, and she quickly switched languages, apologizing. After recording my details, she escorted me to my room. I was quite surprised with what I was seeing. I didn't understand why people didn't leave better reviews for that place, because apparently it was very good. That made me curious. It was clear that I was missing something. I went up to my room and decided to rest for a while. The trip had been long, and I needed to clear my mind to write. It was still noon, so I had time to get to know the place. I tried not to let too much light through the window and lay down on the bed. I really shouldn't have been aware of how tired I was. I woke up at 8 o'clock in the evening. It was already dark outside and I was very hungry. I was actually quite groggy. Sleeping so many hours during the day was rare for me, but I took a shower and ran downstairs to the dining room. To my surprise, there was no one there. I was all alone in a huge room with stone walls. The same receptionist who had served me in the morning brought me a small laminated sheet where I could read the menu. I wanted to try everything, but I was going to stay 2 weeks, and I didn't want to bore the food. So I opted for the pasta carbonara. I was so hungry that I needed something hearty, something that would satisfy me. And the truth is that it did. It was a very generous portion, and it was absolutely delicious. Maybe it was because of hunger, but at that moment I thought it was the best pasta I had ever eaten in my life. I was offered dessert, but I'm not much of a sweet tooth, so I declined. I simply ordered a tea and just sat there watching. I was again surprised that no one else came into the dining room. It was dinner time, and I knew there were more guests. The receptionist came back from time to time to ask me if I needed anything. I saw absolutely no one. I decided to go out to the back garden. I would take advantage of the fact that it was still early to read. There were more people there. Everyone was engrossed in their books, cell phone or headphones, so I didn't exchange a single word with them. But I did notice that when I saw myself leaving the dining room, they all looked at me. I thought it was simply because I was new. I immersed myself in my reading and lost track of time. 2 hours later, the lights went out in the garden. I understood that it was time for each guest to go to their room, so without thinking too much, I took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Through the corridors, I saw quite a few people, and that reminded me again that the dining room was empty. I made my own mental note to check the prices of the food, so I wouldn't spend my paycheck just to eat. I brushed my teeth and got into bed, but after sleeping all afternoon, I knew I wasn't going to fall asleep that quickly. I grabbed my book again and plunged back into the world of the main character, Sarah. I stayed like that until I heard some strange noises in the next room. They were quite loud thumps, as if they were throwing furniture on the floor. I thought it was a couple having a heated argument, only to make up later, but suddenly I heard the door open, and the noises stopped. There were footsteps in the hallway and nothing else. How I missed having a peephole in the door. Around 4 a.m. I fell asleep. The next day, the dining room looked like something else. There were 8 of us guests, and everyone was having breakfast happily. 2 of them came up to me. "Hi, how are you? Are you new?" I told them yes, and they told me they had also just arrived. Louise had separated from his wife, I needed a few days away from everything. He didn't have money to pay for a spiritual retreat, but since the hotel had a garden and a forest in the back, it suited him. Mario, on the other hand, was a publicist and was on his way from one congress to another. He was going to work from there. We spent a long time chatting about our things, and then I went to my room to write. The creative life, although it may not seem like it, also needs a schedule. We agreed to meet at lunchtime, and that made me quite happy. It's always good to eat together. The morning flew by. I'd decided on several important points in my new novel. I usually write mystery prose, but to tell the truth, maintaining that thread of tension is very complicated, so sometimes I need moments of disconnection. At the appointed time, I went down to the dining room. My 2 new friends were waiting for me at the table. There was only one other person there. After greeting them, I told them that I was surprised that there were so few people in the dining room when the food was so good. Mario said that the night before, he had seen a man eating a sandwich in the hallway. The 3 of us agreed that maybe they couldn't afford that much. Still, I kept thinking. The receptionist, who was as spotless as the first day, left us the menu and added that there were several dishes with the house specialty, mushrooms. I had no idea that was the specialty, but I hated them with all my might. My parents used to give them to me when I was little, until they discovered that they were bad for me, and I was able to get rid of them. I ordered a salad and a veal steak. Mario had rice with seafood, and Louise went for the mushrooms. He said they were delicious, but just looking at them made me sick. Before we left, the receptionist came back to our table. She asked Louise which room he was in. Apparently, there were some glitches in his registration. The afternoon passed normally. After writing for a couple of hours, I met the guys for a walk around. Louise was feeling a bit under the weather. He said the nap had left him groggy, but he was still encouraged to walk around in the fresh air for a while. We wandered into the woods out back and discovered a large greenhouse. We wanted to look around to see what they were planting, but it was hermetically sealed on all sides. We only saw a couple of workers, but when we greeted them, they didn't even answer us. They lowered their heads and continued on their way. We laughed at their sassiness and kept walking. The surroundings were truly beautiful. There were trees of all species and lots of vegetation. We also saw a kind of shed. It was locked with padlocks and the windows had bars on them. In addition, a little before the entrance, there was a sign prohibiting anyone outside the company from entering. What company? I asked myself. As a writer, all these mysterious things aroused in me a great curiosity. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want my new friends to think I was crazy. I shut my mouth and we continued walking. Louise was already feeling much better. The walk had been great for him. We returned just in time for dinner. We entered the dining room, but not before crossing paths with a couple of people who looked at us strangely. Now it wasn't just me who was surprised. My colleagues commented on it as well. People were surprised that we were using the hotel dining room so much. What was the point of that? We sat down, and again the receptionist brought us the menu. To tell the truth, I already knew it by heart. She insisted that we could sit separately if we wanted, but all 3 of us agreed that we preferred to eat together. Louise was offered a sautéed mushroom dish and asked us if we would like to try it this time. Mario said yes, but he wanted a tiny portion just to taste them. I continued with my disgust for those plants and asked for a fish soup. This time the receptionist wanted to check Mario's room. I fell asleep very early that night. I was awakened by a loud knock on the door at about 2 a.m. It was Louise, who felt sick and wanted to know if I had any medicine for my stomach. He looked terrible, but I didn't have any. I rarely got sick, and when I did, it was usually a sore throat. He told me he would try to find someone around the hotel, and I offered to go get help instead. When I came downstairs, the receptionist was in her chair. This girl ever sleep? I went over, giving her a good scare, and told her what was going on. She told me that they had a doctor on staff and would send him to Louise's room right away. I was very surprised that they had a doctor on staff. Not even in the big resorts did they have one. I went upstairs and told Louise that the doctor would be right there. I went back to my room and immediately fell asleep. That night I had nightmares about the greenhouse we'd seen in the afternoon. I woke up with a strange feeling. I usually have good instincts, and they didn't fail me that day either. I went down to breakfast very early. Mario was there, as always eager to have his first coffee of the day. We waited a long time for Louise to come down, but he didn't show up. I was quite worried, so I asked the receptionist if she knew anything. She told me that Louise was resting, as the doctor had recommended. It made perfect sense, so I went on with my day. The mornings were being quite productive in that place. I was making good progress on my novel, but that day, I was distracted. I couldn't stop thinking about the mysteriousness of the place. I told Mario that I preferred to walk alone that afternoon, that I needed to find inspiration for one of my chapters. We arranged to meet for dinner, and I left just before lunch. I wasn't hungry, so I thought I'd go to a supermarket and have a snack. After shopping, I went back to the back of the hotel. Everything was the same as the last time we walked there. There was no way to see what they were planting, not even a small hole in the tarp. I passed a worker who again looked away from me, but this time I insisted. "Excuse me, do you know what they plant here?" He turned and said, "You wouldn't want to know," and went on his way. His face was totally haggard, pale, and with a lot of dark circles under his eyes. I then approached the shed and accessed the back. I tried to see through the window what was inside, but I could see only black tarpaulins. They were covering some piles of dirt. Nothing looked suspicious. I decided to leave and come back at night. There were things that didn't add up, and after what the operator had told me, I needed answers. When I came back, I met Mario at the entrance. He had heard strange noises in Louise's room. That's why he had knocked on the door, but no one opened it. Later, he saw the cleaners enter his room, which now had the door wide open. No one was there. Louise would not have left without saying goodbye, so I quickly went down to reception. The young lady very kindly told me that indeed the guest in 302 had gone home to recuperate fully. She asked him to give us his regards just like that. That sounded very strange to me. And to top it off, now it was Mario who was unwell. I asked him what he had eaten, and he told me ravioli stuffed with mushrooms. Then it all made sense to me. Maybe they were using the wrong mushrooms. But were they doing it on purpose? If they were causing indigestion among the guests, surely they had already thought about it. I still had several days left, so I would keep an eye on things. In any case, I told Mario not to eat any more mushrooms. He answered, "What are you talking about, man? They're delicious." That night, as I had planned, I went back down. I grabbed my Swiss Army knife and went first to the greenhouse. I was convinced to cut the tarp to see what was hidden inside, but something caught my eye. 2 workers were wheeling a wheelbarrow toward the shed. They opened the door and went inside. I didn't know whether to follow them or to go ahead with my plan, and in the end, I opted for the second option. I thought that if they were distracted there, they would not notice my presence. I managed to gain access to the greenhouse, and then I could read a label, Amanita phalloides. What was that? I had no idea, but I wrote it down in my notebook and ran out of there. I hid under some bushes and waited to see if the workers would come out, but nothing. There was light in there, and for the 2 hours I was hiding, nobody came out of the shed. What could they be doing for so long? The situation became an obsession. My instinct told me that something strange was going on, but there was little else I could do at that moment, so I went back to my room. I turned on the computer and Googled Amanita phalloides, and then I understood everything. It's a very poisonous mushroom species, although similar in appearance to other edible mushrooms. They were poisoning people. I couldn't wait and ran to Mario's room. I knocked on the door several times, but no one would open it. I was completely desperate. I didn't want anything bad to happen to him, so I decided to go down to the kitchen. I was lucky that the receptionist was not in her place, so I got through without any problems. The kitchen was also deserted, and I didn't find anything strange. What could I do with that information? Should I call the police? I decided to wait for the next day and talk to Mario. But the next day, Mario did not show up. Again, the receptionist told me that he had left because he was indisposed. I thought that was absurd, so I ran off in the direction of the shed. The receptionist kept shouting my name and asking me to stop, but I didn't. I reached the entrance, and just then 2 workers were coming out. I pushed them away and lifted one of the tarpaulins. I couldn't believe it. They were Louise and Mario. They were dead and piled up next to other bodies. The receptionist was following me closely, and when she saw me inside, she took a gun out of her pocket. But just at that moment, a police patrol arrived and saved me. One of the operators, seeing what was about to happen, had reported what had happened. He could not carry more dead bodies. Upon inspecting the area, they found the famous hotel cook. She was an old lady, hairless and with many kilos. At the time of the arrest, she was in the greenhouse, fertilizing her mushrooms with human body parts. After many investigations, they concluded that the people in charge of that organization were experimenting with different amounts of poisonous fungus to see how far the bodies would resist. Once they died, they performed a thorough autopsy. In this way, they were creating an even more poisonous fungus, more and more lethal. I didn't finish my novel, but I decided this story deserved to be told because I could never think of anything more terrifying than my vacation in a roadside hotel.
Fran, Oscar, Carlos, and Antonio shared the same passion: the viral challenges that circulated on the internet. They had proven their bravery in a wide range of challenges, from the most popular to the most obscure and little known. They already had a great experience, and they demonstrated it on their YouTube channel. Although they hadn't gained a large number of followers, they didn't care. Fame and money were not their motivation. They simply enjoyed the entertainment that the challenges provided. They really wanted to face a new, extremely extreme one, something that would test their limits. So after exhaustively researching, they found one called the Crow Challenge. It was said that the winner would experience a full life if all went well, although the most likely option was failure and could end the player's own life. Oscar, the most skeptical, initially opposed it, considering it meaningless. On the other hand, Antonio wasn't entirely in favor, although his objections came from a completely opposite perspective. He had quite a bit of respect for it. However, Fran and Carlos managed to convince them. The challenge could be done alone or in a group. To begin with, they had to meet in a dark environment, and if there were several participants, position themselves in such a way that everyone could see each other. After making the intro to a video for their channel, they headed to Fran's room. Once there, they closed the door and lowered the blinds, creating the perfect atmosphere. The first phase required reciting in Latin. "Black crow, fix your gaze on us, the wings are about to unfold." So the four friends, arranged in a circle, intoned the words. Next, they waited for at least 6 minutes, the stipulated time for the crows to arrive from the underworld, according to the instructions. "The challenge has begun," the page announced. "Now each of you is under the gaze of a crow from the abyss, although it hasn't yet arrived. This is your last chance to turn around. However, if you do, you must be aware that one of the crows will be watching you for life." "Do you want to leave?" Oscar said, mocking Antonio. "Leave it now," Fran scolded him. Before moving on to the next phase, a prayer was required to be recited, also in Latin. The first part said, "First door, door of fear, open." The four of them came together and said the Latin words in unison. Then they went to the bathroom, each one with a lit candle, and stood in front of the mirror. The challenge instructions continued. "The candle will act as a guide to attract a crow to our world. The process will take 3 minutes. However, the abyss is a place of deep darkness. If the candle is not extinguished at that moment, the crow will be dazzled and his eyes will burn. For this reason, the crow will only come if the following prayer is recited in Latin. All-seeing crow, may this light illuminate your path to our world, and I promise by my eyes that I will not hurt yours." The four friends said the entire prayer at the same time in front of the mirror. To ensure they met the exact time, they set the stopwatch on their mobile phones that would tell them when to blow out the candle. The 3rd minute arrived. Fran, Carlos, and Antonio extinguished the candle instantly. However, Oscar didn't do so. He blew, but it wasn't enough and the candle was lit again. Surprised, he blew again, and then he managed to put it out. Antonio looked at him with concern. Oscar noticed his friend's face and assured him in a firm voice, without betraying any hint of fear, that nothing was going to happen to him. They continued with the next step, in which they had to play a melody with an ocarina, or failing that, a flute. However, whoever chose to play the melody with the flute had to know that their margin of error was 0. With the ocarina, on the other hand, they could have up to 3 errors. They opted for the flute because Fran had 1 collecting dust in an old drawer. 1 was enough, since it was not necessary for everyone to play at the same time. Fran read the instructions aloud. "Now that the crow is in your world, you must get it to follow you. To achieve this, you must play a melody with the crow's favorite instrument, the ocarina. The crow will only accept 3 errors. A flute can also be used, but the crow doesn't enjoy it as much, so there can be no mistakes." You will only listen once the second opening sentence is done, so it can be practiced. However, the crow's patience is not infinite. It will only wait 3 days. If done in a group, each person must play separately, and the prayer must also be individual. Any melody that consists of exactly 10 notes, all of them low, is accepted. The 4 practiced their respective melodies, and the next day they met in Fran's yard. The prayer, which was to be pronounced in Latin, was: "Second gate, gate of dedication, open. Crow that hears everything, may this melody serve to gain your trust. I offer my ears as a guarantee." Carlos was the first, recited the prayer in Latin, and began to play. He did it without making mistakes. The same thing happened with Fran and Oscar. Then it was Antonio's turn. He looked nervous. He said the prayer and began to play the melody. However, around the 7th note, he went out of tune. His expression after finishing reflected even greater concern. Fran and Oscar noticed his nervousness and quickly encouraged him with reassuring words, assuring him that it was just a game and that nothing was going to happen to him, that all of that was nonsense that people made up. However, his tranquility didn't last long. A day later, they decided to continue with the recordings and the challenge. Antonio arrived very nervous, saying that they should stop with that challenge. He felt like he was starting to lose his hearing. Oscar reacted as always, with ridicule and telling him that this was just his subconscious. But Antonio was convinced that he was right. "No, Oscar, it is not my subconscious. Do you remember that you also told me that yesterday you started to see blurry?" His friend started laughing out loud and argued that he had spent many hours editing in front of the computer. He told him that he was hallucinating and that he had taken that challenge seriously. Even so, Antonio tried to convince his friends to stop and not continue with that dangerous challenge. Since everyone seemed to ignore him, in a fit of hysteria, he took his cell phone out of his pocket and decided to delete the YouTube channel. The young people threw up their hands. All the material they had created over the years had disappeared. Antonio didn't show regret. He felt that he had to do it so that his friends would have no reason to end that challenge. But Fran tried to reassure the group with his words. "I never did this for you two. I did it to hang out with my friends. The crow challenge is just for that, having an entertaining moment. Nothing bad's gonna happen. Furthermore, even if it were true, we have already started it. And it is assumed that if we abandon it, we will lose and the consequences could be fatal. So let's continue having fun as always." His speech seemed to convince them all. At this time, it was already the 3rd day, so they continued right there, although the situation was becoming quite complicated. They read the instructions aloud so they could continue. "Now a crow is interested in you. However, he still doesn't fully trust. To achieve that, you must cook a dish and leave it ready in a place where you can see the moon. You must prepare a dish for each member of the group. Crows eat raw food, so no cooking is necessary. You just have to put the ingredients together. The opening prayer should be performed before cooking, and the other when placing the plate in the place where the crow will dine. Both prayers should be said in a round if you're in a group. The ingredients are the wing of a bird, a chicken wing will suffice, a fruit, a few drops of human blood, and a corpse, whether of an animal or human, but it must be whole." They had no problems with the first 3 ingredients. The difficulty lay in the last one. Frank grabbed a bird his dog had caught. Oscar ran to the road and found a toad that had been run over. Antonio used one of the fish his father had caught the day before. Carlos, however, failed to achieve anything. "It looks like I'm going to be the only one to overcome this challenge," commented Fran. The opening prayer read, "Third gate, gate of pleasure, open." They placed all the ingredients on a plate each and went up to the roof of Fran's house. They didn't have time to look for a better place, and they continued with the words, "Crow that tests and judges everything, let this dish be the necessary proof on me. I swear by my stomach that it will please you." They slept together, and during the night, Fran got up while his friends continued sleeping. He went up to the roof. Despite his speech, he still doubted if all that was true. Since he was the only one who hadn't failed, he didn't care if it was real or not. He preferred his friends to continue believing that everything was a fable. When he arrived, he saw the empty plates. It could have been a cat that had raided them, but he just took them down and washed them. He would say he couldn't wait because he needed the dishes cleaned as soon as possible. They reached the next step. It was the most peculiar. They had to get a mannequin, put a wig on it, and a black dress or suit. Once with clothes, they had to take him to an abandoned building or under construction. So they created a small mannequin with a black dress and blonde wig. They took him to an abandoned hospital and left him in one of the rooms of the second floor. Before leaving, they said in Latin, "Fourth gate, gate of meeting, open." And they read the rest of the instructions. Once you have located the figure, you must leave and return at least the next day and at most 3 days later. However, you should not go alone. Each one must have a companion. The gender and age of the person accompanying you doesn't matter. All of you together must remove the mannequin and spend the night in the same place. At this stage, the crows don't allow separation. If the crow is interested, it may choose your companion for you. The friends stared at each other in surprise. Who could ask for something so peculiar? Who would accept such a proposal? They spent 2 days thinking about it, and it seemed like they wouldn't find anyone willing. However, on the second day, during his literature class, his homework assignment was to write a horror story. Fran wrote about ghosts. Carlos shared one of his most recent nightmares. Antonio developed a story about monsters, while Oscar chose to capture the steps of the Crow's challenge. On the third day, they found their companions. 4 literature professors were attracted to Oscar's imagination. Although they were disappointed to learn that he had taken it from the internet, the teachers were interested in the challenge and decided to offer their help. That same night, the 8 headed to the abandoned hospital. Upon arrival, they discovered that the entrance to the room where the mannequin was located was blocked due to a collapse. The young people became discouraged, but the teacher suggested entering through the window. It was risky. One had to reach the window of the room adjacent to the mannequin from outside, while another held him in his arms. Fran volunteered to venture out the window. After all, risk was part of what they were looking for in that game. One of the teachers supported him as he snuck inside. The plan was carried out successfully, and the 8 returned safely with the mannequin. They spent the night together at Fran's house. Both the parents and the sister weren't at home. They had been away for 10 days. Fran slept on the couch, his friends in his room and his sisters, and the teachers in the guest rooms. Fran woke up at 10 in the morning. He looked out the window and saw the 4 teachers. They were staring at the house. "Are you okay? Where are the boys?" the young man asked, but they took a while to respond. One of the teachers answered that they were still sleeping, but something was smelling strange to Fran. He ran towards his room. He didn't find anyone. He looked in his sister's room. Nobody. In his parents'. Neither. Not even in the guest room. If it had been any other time, he might have thought it was a bad joke, but not. Not after seeing that all the plates, except Carlos, were empty. That challenge had stopped seeming harmless to him, so he decided to lock all the doors. The teachers slowly approached the window. Fran lowered the blind in their faces while they hid it. The challenge of the crow. That was all the fault of that damn challenge. The only way to survive was to complete it. So he grabbed the mannequin and decided to go to the garage. There, he would have more time to think. When he passed through the garden, what he saw chilled him. There were 4 crosses, and on 3 of them lay the lifeless bodies of his friends. "You heard his eyes, now he will take yours," it said, carved under the body of Oscar, whose eyes were missing. "You heard his ears, now he will take yours," was written under the corpse of Antonio, whose ears had been removed. "You heard his stomach, now he will take yours," appeared on the Carlos' gutted body. They all shared 2 terrifying characteristics, in addition to their chilling fate: a deep cut on their chest and a drawing of a crow carved into their right arms. Then he remembered the last 3 steps. Cut off his right arm in the shape of a crow and upload a photo of that bird in a public place and publish it on a social network. He locked the garage door, placed the mannequin, and began to recite in Latin. "Last gate, gate of the end, open. May all my sacrifices have been sufficient to be to your liking. And if they aren't, have a representative of yours take my life as an eternal apology, because I don't deserve to see you in person." The zipper on the mannequin's dress began to unzip. Suddenly, a blonde girl emerged from the mannequin wearing a black dress, the same as the mannequin, but with feathers. It was clear that she was a representative and his death was inevitable. But she's just a girl. However, a crow emerged from the girl's face, his beak stuck into the young man's leg, and then disappeared. The girl dodged the kick, threw him to the ground, grabbed a knife, and stabbed Fran's hand into the ground. She repeated the same action with the other. With a third knife, she carved a crow into the young man's right arm. Then she grabbed his cell phone and walked away. It was useless to try to free himself. The knives were stuck deep, but Fran didn't want to die. He struggled with the severed hands and managed to get up. His hands were divided almost in half. The pain was unbearable, but he still managed to kick the phone out of the girl's hand. He thought that if he destroyed the phone, the girl wouldn't be able to post the image and perhaps he could be saved. He ran to where his cell phone was, about to step on it and break it, but one of the literature teachers broke the window, grabbed him by the neck and took him outside. The 4 teachers immobilized him and he could do nothing but watch as the girl grabbed his cell phone and posted the image. Then she approached him with a knife in her hand. 4 crows came from the void upon hearing the call, said the girl. But they met 4 young men who took it as a joke. Maybe you didn't fail any of the tests, but like the other 3, you failed to give your heart to the crow. Now, it will take yours.
Sometimes the human mind can lead us to commit real barbarities, and today we want to tell you about one of those cases. Let's move to Nizhny Novgorod, a Russian city. There, in 2011, different destroyed, looted, and desecrated tombs began to appear. Apparently, there was no link between the families, but the desecrations kept happening. The families were absolutely desperate. At that time, there was a person in the area who had gained fame for the study of municipal cemeteries. He was a historian and loved the occult. His name was Anatoly Moskvin, and together with other colleagues in the early 2000s, he had used statistical and study elements on the causes of deaths of people buried in the region. Their aim was to extract data on most causes of death. He therefore came to call himself a necropologist. This had much to do with his fondness for all things occult. On top of this, he was a professor at the Moscow State University and spoke 13 languages. For all this, in 2011, when the police began investigations into what was going on in the local cemetery, they asked him for help. He, of course, accepted the assignment. But in the midst of the investigations, an officer spotted him after hours in the middle of the cemetery, dragging a large bag. When he opened it, it contained bones. This precipitated the events. The police applied for a warrant to search his house. It was a routine process. They could never have imagined the scene they encountered. Everywhere they looked, there were shelves full of books, toys, and small children's clothes. But that wasn't the worst of it. The most shocking were the dolls. They were perfectly seated or placed in places where children could be. Sofas, beds, carpets. The investigators were struck by something else, the terrible smell in that house. The dolls were large and life-size. When they approached them, they found that it was much worse than they thought. They were hiding behind their clothes and masks the corpses of mummified girls and women. Moskvin confessed to being responsible for some 150 grave desecrations. He stole the corpses of girls and women and mummified them to transform them into dolls. He made each corpse a wax mask and painted its features with nail polish. Each body was dressed differently as he collected clothes and shoes. To embalm them, he used a mixture of salt and baking soda. In his house, they also found updated information on each girl. He kept a record of their lives and also documented the process of turning them into dolls. He kept pieces of tombstones, photographs, a real horror. In total, the bodies of 26 girls were found inside his house. At no time did Anatoly Moskvin want to deny the facts. What's more, he cooperated with the police, giving all the details about the procedures he used. He said such astonishing things as he tried to resuscitate the girls by placing music boxes inside them. In addition, he used to read them stories or tell them stories. They all had her name and her very definite personality. After investigations, it was learned that her interest in corpses began when she was only 12 years old. At that time, a classmate of hers passed away. Anatoly went to the funeral, and there he was forced to give a kiss to the deceased. That was the beginning of his macabre hobby. During his statements, the Russian claimed to be fully aware that he was committing a crime, but he felt the need to give these girls a second life. He claimed that the dead children would call him. He would go to their graves and ask for permission to dig them up. At that point, he would take them to his house to start the process. At the trial, he himself said in front of the victims' families that he was happy he did it. He believed he could bring the girls back to life through science and black magic. And in conclusion, he said, "You abandon your girls in the cold. I took them to my house and gave them shelter." Anatoly was declared mentally ill and was committed to a psychiatric clinic, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Don't you think it's terrible what he did?
The legend says that many years ago, in a town, lived a mother with her 3 children. Misfortune had knocked on their door when the father of the family died in an accident, leaving the wife alone with the children. After a while, the woman found a new partner and remarried. Again, there were 5 at home, but unfortunately this union was critical for the children because their stepfather was violent towards them. He mistreated them secretly from their mother for no reason and imposed severe punishments such as taking away their food, denying them water, or locking them in the basement. Although his behavior was mean and abusive towards all the little ones, much of his anger was vented on the eldest daughter, who received the most beatings and scoldings. On one of those occasions, the man was blinded by his fury and violently threw the girl down the stairs, causing her death on the spot. Frightened by the possible consequences, the stepfather fled, and the mother, with her 2 little ones, decided to leave home to avoid remembering every day the death of the minor on those stairs. The house was put up for rent, and it went through several tenants, but all of them were short-lived. They claimed to hear a child's voice asking for help. The house became a scene of terror. Screams and wailing could be heard, and the doors opened and closed by themselves. The spirit even came to knock on the door to ask for water. The most disturbing thing was that when someone passed by on the stairs, he could feel their presence. It was as if the girl was placed in that place where she had met her death. It isn't known if she was taking care of the other tenants, trying not to let them fall down the stairs, or if she was waiting for the right moment to push them and make them suffer the same fate. Some claimed to see her, others only heard her. Although they were unaware of their intentions, for some people, these paranormal events were enough to scare them for life. Although no other person died while the house was inhabited, rumors made it so that no one else wanted to live there. It is said that the house remains abandoned in the middle of the field, and that some nights, hikers who passed by came to see the ghost of a girl leaning out of the window, sometimes asking for help, other times just watching them in silence. If you know the area and risk going in, never go near the stairs. Better not to know the intentions of this spirit. It was summer and classes had come to an end. Jake was excited because on those dates they always moved to his grandparents' house. Accustomed to living during the rest of the year between buildings and roads, for him it was the best season because his grandparents lived in a rural area. There he could swim in the river, climb the trees, discover many animals. In that town, he had many things to have fun with. The only bad thing was that all the neighbors were elderly. Even the village school had been closed 30 years ago. He was the only child there. He was allowed to do whatever he wanted. Well, everything except go across the river to the old school. His grandparents always told him that that place was very dirty and there were rats, that there were glass and he could be cut. In short, they didn't want him to go there. One day, playing on the swings in the garden, he heard some children laughing. He was very surprised and ran to see where the voices were coming from. Would he finally have a friend to play with? When he got closer to the river, he could see a group of children playing in the abandoned schoolyard. He stood watching from a distance, and soon one of the little ones looked up and smiled at him. "Hello, come and play with us," he told him. All the children, with an exaggeratedly long smile, began to shout at the same time. Be our friend! Be our friend! Jake knew his grandparents would be upset if he disobeyed them, but he was so excited that he decided to cross to the other side of the river. Carefully, he jumped between the stones that allowed him to cross the stream. As he got closer, the children's singing became louder and their smiles grew wider and wider. Just as he was about to jump the last stone, a hand grabbed him from behind. It was his grandfather dragging him home. Upon arrival, the boy asked him why he couldn't go, and his grandfather told him that it was a dangerous place. Dangerous? But there was nothing. As the days passed, Jake couldn't get those kids out of his mind. He couldn't have fun with anything, he just wanted to go back there and see if they were still in the same place. So without his grandparents knowing, he sneaked out of the house and ran to the river. When he was close, he could hear the children calling him again. Be our friend! Be our friend! They were laughing out loud. It looked like they were having a great time. Their mouths were drawn into a smile so long it seemed unreal. They were really happy that Jake was there with them. When he jumped over the small wall of the school, he saw that on the wall there was an old mural with some children painted on it. It was very worn. That painting had to be at least 30 years old, as many as the center had been closed. As the group approached him to greet him, he felt a chill. Those children were identical to those in the old mural. Nah, impossible. This school has been closed for many years. Jay walked hand in hand with those little ones and played and played. He lost count of how long he had been there. Minutes? Hours? Days? Years. Jake didn't go back to his grandparents' house, even though the abandoned schoolyard has a new drawing on the mural. Now, there are 5 children painted.
Welcome once again, horror lovers. Today we bring you a story that took place in 1975. So prepare yourselves, because we bet you'll enjoy this tale. One day, a single mother and her 12-year-old daughter Eli were invited to a party at her grandparents' house. They were celebrating 40 years of marriage, and although their relationship with their daughter was pretty rocky, they still wanted to share such a special day with her and Eli. However, at the last minute, the mother decided to just leave Eli at the party and then go away. She didn't want to be there and had a lot of work to do. After the party, Eli's grandparents drove her to her house. However, they noticed something strange at the entrance, so they asked their granddaughter to wait in the car. Unfortunately, Eli decided to follow them into the house silently, without them noticing. What they found was absolutely horrifying. As soon as the grandma crossed the doorstep, she let out a terrifying scream. Her daughter was on the floor, dead, with an expression of true horror on her face. There was a note next to the body, which said, "Don't you dare answer them." Little Eli was frozen in shock, observing the body of her mother for the last time. The case was closed due to a lack of evidence of aggression, and the police declared it as a natural death. Eli then moved in with her grandparents, who took custody of her to raise her and give her love. They lived in an old military residential area. They hardly had any neighbors left, but they loved it there, precisely because of the peace and quiet of the place. Years passed. Eli grew up, and her grandparents would leave her alone in the house every now and then. One of those times, she was in the living room watching TV, when out of the blue she heard someone call her name. Elizabeth. Her first reaction was to turn around to see who was calling her, but then she remembered that she was alone and thought that maybe it had been just the product of her imagination. Eli decided to go to bed, as her grandparents would be back soon. However, she once again heard someone calling her name. She thought that maybe her grandparents had arrived. "Yes, Grandma," she said. Nobody responded, so Eli insisted. When she received no response, she went downstairs to see if her grandparents had come back. But no, The house was completely empty. That made her feel very nervous, so she locked herself in her grandparents' room and grabbed a bat. Eli couldn't stop thinking about the day her mother died. Then, that voice called her yet again, and she would respond, but nobody would answer back. Eli was terrified, and all of a sudden, she heard the steps of someone running towards the room. She froze in place when she saw the door opening slowly. But then, nothing else happened. Eli decided to get up and look at the hallway. When she didn't see anybody there, she started to cry, frustrated at everything that was happening. She then grabbed her mobile phone and tried to call her grandparents, but the phone had no signal. It was all like a nightmare, and when she still had the phone on her ear, she heard the same voice through it, "Elizabeth." She threw her phone as far away as she could and rushed to her room to get under her bed sheets, feeling extremely scared. But then she heard how someone was unlocking the front door and also heard someone yelling her name again. She thought she was saved and ran downstairs looking for her grandparents, but to her shock, nobody was there. Eli felt lost, puzzled, and scared. She started crying again as she went back upstairs, desperate for that nightmare to end once and for all. But when she arrived, her grandma was right there. Or so she thought. When Eli looked at her more closely, she realized something was wrong. Those eyes were filled with hate and didn't look at all like her grandma's loving eyes. That wasn't Eli's grandma. But who was that then? The strange figure then proceeded to say, "Don't you dare answer us." That phrase brought horrible memories to Eli, and suddenly the lights turned off and she felt like everything around her was moving. That figure got closer until it grabbed Eli's feet. She thought that was her end, but suddenly she heard someone running up the stairs, and then her real grandma entered the room. That strange figure immediately vanished, and Eli and her grandma hugged. Eli's grandma explained that the figure was an evil spirit which takes advantage of people who answer its call, that Eli's mother was a victim of that evil being, and that the spirit cannot do anything when faced by the person it stole the shape from. Eli's grandma had saved her, and Eli would always remember to never, ever respond to them. Welcome back, horror lovers. You can't deny that human beings are distrustful by nature. When in doubt, many times we tend to think ill of others, even if they're very close to us. This is the story of a man who really mistrusted his greatest love, bringing him terrible consequences. It happened at the beginning of the previous century, when customs were different, especially in regards to romantic relationships. And the higher the social class, the more restrictive everything was. The young lads from the nobility would politely court the ladies, always with permission from her family. They could not have dates alone. That was immoral and would immediately cause rumors among people. They had to wait to be married to have intimacy. Matilda and Alonso knew each other since childhood. Their families owned huge plots of farmland and kept a close friendship for many generations. When they saw them playing as kids, they already saw them being together in the future, merging the riches of both houses. Thus, due to their closeness and pressure from their parents, it was natural for them to end up becoming a couple, as well as getting engaged. However, like in every arranged marriage, they both had their doubts. Alonso didn't trust Matilda's true character. He was feeling he didn't know her true personality, and only knew the exterior facade she showed. He tried getting closer to her, looking for a moment when they could be alone, but she was very prude and always avoided that. Then one night, shortly before their wedding, Alonso thought of the perfect excuse. They would use an old empty mansion he owned to organize a huge party with all their friends and celebrate the occasion. Thus, being away from the family, he would finally have his chance. However, the night didn't start as he expected, and during dinner, Matilda focused more on serving the guests instead of being with him. After that, they all gathered at the big main hall to look for something to do. The guests were all pretty excited, and Matilda innocently proposed to them to play hide and seek. The idea was great, and she chose Alonso as the first one to seek the others. He immediately understood her plan. If he could find Matilda, they would finally be able to be together. The guests hid in different parts of the house, while the soon-to-be groom counted while facing one corner, to then go look for them. One by one, he found each guest, who would go back to the main hall to have fun. However, after it was midnight and looking around the entire house, Alonso had found everyone, except for one person. Matilda was nowhere to be found. Worried, Alonso gave up and asked the others to help him find her. They searched the entire house, looking in every nook and cranny, from the basement to the attic. But it was futile. Nobody found the soon-to-be bride. The search expanded to the neighboring areas, and Alonso's fear turned into anger when the guests started to speculate that maybe Matilda had run away. Suddenly, everything made sense in his mind. Matilda completely changed her mind about marrying, and taking advantage of being away from her family, she proposed a game of hide and seek to be able to run away from Alonso. She had abandoned him like a dog, leaving him humiliated in front of everyone. The next day, with no news about Matilda, the marriage was canceled, and Alonso never wanted to hear about her ever again. Nobody saw Matilda again, although some claimed to have seen her running away in the middle of the night, joined by another man. Young Alonso, with his heart broken, didn't take long to engage with another lady from another wealthy family and got married within a year. And despite Alonso's reluctance, they decided to go live at the family mansion where everything happened. While the servants cleaned everything and prepared the mansion for the newlyweds, one of the maids found in one of the most remote rooms an old chest that seemed to have been locked for years. She looked for the key to open it and see what was inside, and when she opened the lid, a scream of horror resounded around the entire house. Everyone rushed to the room to discover, in horror, that within the chest was the lifeless body of a woman, with her clothes worn down and her flesh decomposing. From her dress, Alonso immediately knew who it was. Matilda, the one he harshly condemned that fateful night, while she was stuck in that chest, unable to get out.
Hello, horror lovers. Today, we bring you one of your favorites, another supernatural story. To give you context, this story takes place in Wyberton, a town located in the southwest of Boston, England. It is a calm and isolated area surrounded by farm fields. Frederick was doing an internship at a school in Wyberton to do his practice as a teacher and also to learn a new language. He remembered the first day as if it was yesterday. He arrived on a Monday, and as soon as he left his suitcases, the principal welcomed him to guide him during the workday. When Frederick saw the principal, he couldn't help but notice a very tired expression on his face, and the pale tone of his skin highlighted even more the purple of his eye bags. What impacted Frederick the most in his first class was the silence. It was so quiet he could almost hear everyone's heartbeats. The students had a discipline and serenity he had never seen before. As soon as Frederick went into the classroom, the principal asked him to introduce himself. Frederick wrote his name on the blackboard and briefly talked about who he was, his studies, and his hobbies. Then came the time for him to start the class, and when he least expected it, between the nerves and how well he was feeling working as a teacher, he was startled by the sound of the alarm, which indicated the end of that class. Once more, the principal came to Frederick to guide him to the next classroom where he would teach his next class. Frederick introduced himself again, and the morning really flew by. All the teachers had lunch together, as it's tradition on the first day of school, and all of them had the same pale skin and bags under their eyes. Frederick simply assumed that was common in Wyberton's townsfolk. And then, when he wanted to say goodbye to go back to his room, thinking that some of the teachers would go to their respective houses, strangely, none of the teachers in that school lived outside the building. Frederick spent the entire afternoon locked in his room. Night came without him realizing it, and in the morning, all the teachers would be called early to start teaching their respective classes. He prepared all the content for the next day and went to bed. He then started to think about how weird everything was feeling, how it felt like time was passing at a different pace in that place. He didn't see anyone through his window all day, even though it faced in the same direction as the building's main gate. Then Friday came. He couldn't sleep well any of the previous nights. He was very tired and needed to clear his head. So, after finishing his first week of work, he thought he would feel better if he had a walk around the town. Strangely, he didn't find anyone in the hallways after dinner. Frederick still headed to the main gate, reached the lobby, grabbed the doorknob, but it was locked. He looked for the principal in all the offices, but he was nowhere to be found. Where could he be? Frederick kept searching for the principal but couldn't find him anywhere and thus decided to head back to his room. On the way back, his neck started to itch, and when he scratched it, he noticed a 2-point bite. Damn spiders, he thought. He opened his bag looking for the mirror his mother gave him to see if that bite was infected, but he couldn't find it. He was absolutely sure he brought it with him, and that's when he realized that he had not seen any other mirror in the entire building. The itch from the bite started getting worse, but Frederick decided to just go to bed since it was already dark. Maybe he would find someone to help him in the morning? Well, many hours passed and he couldn't sleep. He really needed to go on a walk. He put on a coat and went back to the main gate. It wouldn't be difficult to jump over it. And just when he was about to jump, he heard the voice of the principal asking Frederick where he was going. Frederick turned around, telling the principal that he needed to go for a walk. The principal said, "You can't go out. The transformation hasn't started yet." Seeing that Frederick didn't understand what was happening, the principal took out the mirror Frederick had been looking for and put it in front of him. Frederick couldn't believe it. His reflection wasn't appearing in the mirror. What was happening? He looked again at the principal, and all of a sudden, he saw himself surrounded by huge numbers of pale people with purple eye bags, including his students. He had no other option than trying to escape. He tried to jump the gate, but they managed to grab his ankle, making him fall on the floor instead. The last thing Frederick saw before closing his eyes were fangs covered in blood approaching him. Hello horror lovers, and welcome to a new video filled with terror. Today we'll be sharing with you the story of Mike, a young guy who's never the same after experiencing the events you're about to hear. Mike was a peaceful guy, the stereotypical obedient lad who never got into trouble and was a good son that every parent wishes they could have. Meanwhile, his best friend Lily, who was also his neighbor, was quite the opposite. She used lots of swear words, would run away from home to be with her friends, was disobedient. However, Lily would behave very differently with Mike. When she was with him, she was sweet and affectionate. She would also stand up to anyone who tried to pick on Mike and would always help him in everything he needed. Actually, they were both in love with each other, but none of them was brave enough to make the first move. The previous weeks, Lily had a lot of issues with her parents. They were very religious and they had grounded her on numerous occasions due to doing things that went against God's will. To Mike, Lily's family was more like a sect. They only wanted to interact with people who believed precisely what they believed, and those who didn't think like them were all sinners. Lily's situation got even worse when, after a very fierce argument with her parents, she screamed something that to them would be considered abhorrent. Basically, besides the insults and swear words, she screamed that she didn't believe in any God and spit on a Bible right in front of them. Mike could hear the screams even from his house. He looked out the window to try to see what was going on, but with no luck. He then decided to go out to the yard to wait for his friend. After being grounded, she would always escape through the guest room window. Mike waited for hours, but she was still inside her house. Suddenly, Mike saw a priest who started knocking on Lily's house. He wasn't the town's priest. Mike had never seen him before. Lily's mother opened the door and invited the priest to come in. Lily's screams coming from inside the house started becoming more and more intense. She was no longer just screaming, but weeping uncontrollably as well. Mike was desperate. He didn't know what to do to help her. If he rang the doorbell, her parents wouldn't let him come in. For them, Mike was a heretic who had instilled bad thoughts into their daughter's mind. Lily kept on screaming. Mike thought about calling the police, but he would need to have evidence that they were actually doing something bad to her. Were they hurting her? Mike wasn't sure. Why would a priest participate in hurting a girl? Suddenly, Mike had an idea. He remembered the guest room's window. He jumped the wall that separated the yard of both houses and tried to open the window. And fortunately, Lily had left it open.
He jumped inside and very carefully tiptoed to the door to hear better. His friend kept on screaming with heart-wrenching intensity. "Let me go! You have no right to do this to me! Let me go!" she cried. At the same time, the priest and her parents were reciting verses that sounded like prayers. Mike finally realized what they were doing to her. They were carrying out an exorcism ritual. Mike jumped out of his hiding place and burst into the room where Lily was being held. She was tied to her bed with ropes and her eyes were whited out. The priest was pointing a crucifix at Lily while drizzling her with holy water. Lily's mother turned around when she saw Mike. She grabbed him from the ears and pushed him towards the main door. While grinding her teeth, she said, "See? We had to do all of this to Lily because of you!" Lily and her family moved away a few days later, and Mike couldn't see her friend ever again. He never received a letter nor a call from her, and he never even knew if she was still alive.
Hello, horror lovers. Living together with strangers can be either the best or the worst experience of our lives. It's very important that you learn about who you will be sharing a living space with before you end up experiencing a terrible surprise, just like it happened in Bremen, Germany. Christian needed money. He couldn't just cover the expenses of the house he rented while studying abroad. That's why he had the idea of sharing one of the rooms that he did not use. He took photos of the entire house and made accounts in a few websites to advertise it online. A few days later, he was jolted awake with a phone call coming from an unknown number. Normally, he wouldn't give it any importance and would just keep going on with his day, since it was usually companies trying to sell him products. However, this time around, the caller left him a message. It was the voice of a young man asking for the price of the room and the address of the house to go see it. The young man said he was a student from another city who was coming to Bremen to start his career. Christian's room was the cheapest for the student, while being the closest to his university. Thus, Christian decided to call the student back, and a few minutes later they arranged a day and time for his visit. The student came punctually at the established time. He told Christian that he loved the place and that it had everything he needed. The student also pointed out that for him, privacy was very important and that he didn't want anybody to go into his room under any circumstance. And so, they closed the deal, and the next month the student moved into Christian's house. At first, their cohabitation was all right. They barely saw each other, since the young man studied in the mornings, while Christian went to work at noon. But even then, they would still eat dinner together and would talk about their day while eating. This went on for a couple of months, until the student started having strange attitudes. First, a horrible smell was now coming from his room. Second, the student gradually became more distant. He no longer waited to have dinner with Christian and wouldn't even say hi when they bumped into each other. And so, Christian would only talk to the student to insist that he sorted out that bad smell coming from his room. Weeks went by, and the smell was getting so horrible that it became unbearable. Thus, while the young man was still at university, Christian took advantage of that to go get into his room. He just couldn't stand living under these conditions any longer, especially without knowing what was causing such a horrible stink. Christian grabbed the doorknob, turned it, and slowly opened the door. It was very dark, so he turned on the lights. The room was completely messy, with a bunch of stuff thrown on the floor. Christian then heard something dripping, and when he observed the room more closely, he noticed a red liquid at the foot of the closet. He then went to open it, and couldn't believe what he was seeing. Hanging human corpses, as well as bags which seemed to be filled with organs. On the side was a saw, and a dish with a knife and a fork on it, all covered in blood. Christian rushed out of there. He had to get to the police station as soon as possible. He waited for the elevator's door to open, and when it arrived, he found himself face to face with the alleged student. After a very brief greeting without looking at the student in the eye, Christian went in and pressed the button. That murderer would go into his room and would find his closet opened and the lights on. Christian didn't have much time. When the police arrived, the room was just as Christian had described it. All the grotesque elements were still there, except for the sadistic murderer who was never found and never heard from again. Maybe that killer moved to a different country and changed his identity. And who knows, he might have been living in somebody else's house. And that homeowner will have no idea about the kind of monster they'll be sharing a roof with.
Hello, horror lovers. Today, we'll be traveling to Idaho in the United States in the year 1950. There, we'll learn the terrifying story of the water babies. They are the ghosts of little kids that the Shoshone tribe drowned in the river. And some say that if you go near the river rocks, you can hear their screams. Some versions of the story say that the babies simply drowned by accident, while others say that the babies ended up developing gills and that now they want to take revenge on all the humans. The river can be found at the Massacre Rocks State Park. Massacre Rocks. That is the place where April's boyfriend suggested that they went on a night trip. He would bring a tent as well as coats and blankets for them to stay warm. He also promised that they would be back before at 8 a.m. so that her mother would never know that she had spent the night out. April didn't think it twice. She grabbed her things and after making sure her mom was asleep, she escaped through the window. April soon arrived at the forest, right at the place where she and her boyfriend had planned. The tent was already set up, but nobody was there. April went into the tent and for 2 hours she waited for her boyfriend to come back. When she saw he wasn't coming, she got really worried and decided to go out and look for him. She didn't have to walk too far away when she started to hear faint whistles. April followed those whistles until she reached the river shore. It's as if the whistles were coming from inside the water. She thought she was going crazy. She bent down to make sure, and suddenly a hand emerged from the water, grabbing her from her hair and pulled her into the water to drown her. April managed to escape, but not without losing a good chunk of hair. When she looked up, she was terrified to see humanoid youngsters with a strange amphibian look. She went for the only option available, to run into the forest and find a way to escape. April reached the tent, and there she remembered she hadn't found her boyfriend yet. She locked herself in, turned on the flashlight, and waited while praying that nothing bad had happened to him. She wanted him to finally show up so they could both leave. April started hearing whistles again. She turned off the flashlight to not give away her location, but the whistles were getting closer and louder. They stopped just outside of the tent. The door opened slowly until she recognized that face. "Hey, you arrived earlier than I expected," said the boyfriend. April told him what just happened, but he didn't believe her. It seems that he had arrived earlier to prepare a surprise for her, and she had gotten the wrong time. They had a picnic just as they had planned, although April wouldn't stop insisting on leaving. Once midnight came, the cold pushed them to cover up in the tent, and when they were about to fall asleep, the whistles came back. April, scared out of her mind, tried to convince her boyfriend to run out of there. However, he told her to wait as he would go out to see what it was. She decided to join him. April's disappearance was reported a few hours later, and her boyfriend's was reported days later. The search teams investigated the entire town and its surroundings. Then one day, a family that was spending a day by the river found the 2 bodies floating in there, filled with bites and signs of strangulation. Javier went out to buy some groceries with his mother. It was raining very heavily, so they decided to drive to the supermarket. After 2 hours and passing by the meat, fish, and frozen food aisles, they were going back to the car with a shopping cart full of groceries. "Achoo! Bless you, son," said Javier's mother. "It wasn't me. I think that noise came from the car." They went near the front of the car and heard meowing. A cat had gotten into the car's engine, looking for warmth. They couldn't turn on the car. They would hurt the cat if they did. So Javier and his mom grabbed bits of bread and tried using them to entice the cat to come out. That idea was a success, and a tiny and unkempt kitty peeked his head out. When he saw the food, he rushed to eat it, starving. He likely hadn't eaten in days. Javier wouldn't stop petting the little one, so his mom allowed him to take the kitty home for the night, and the next day they would take him to an animal shelter. The boy was so happy. He had never had a pet at home, and with a little bit of luck, if the kitty was well behaved, maybe his mom would let him adopt it. As soon as they got home, they gave more food to the kitty, but it seemed that nothing could satisfy his hunger. And if Javier and his mom were eating something, the kitty would appear and snatch whatever they were holding in their hands. They decided to let the kitty sleep in the garage, which was on the house's bottom floor. Then, later that night, when everyone was in bed, Javier was jolted awake after hearing noises that seemed to be coming from there. He stayed still, trying to identify the sounds, but they stopped. Maybe the kitty was messing with the tools and some fell to the floor. The next morning, Javier's alarm clock for school went off. Usually, his mom would also come into his room to make sure he wasn't sleeping anymore, but she didn't do it that morning. Maybe she's looking after the kitty, he thought. Javier got ready and went to the kitchen. His toast and juice of every morning weren't there. Maybe his mom overslept? Before going to wake her up, he decided to go say good morning to the kitty. He opened the garage door, and there he was, meowing at the door. The kitty started walking around Javier, rubbing his head on Javier's shoes. Javier then bent down to pet the kitty for a bit when he saw one of his mom's shoes next to the car. What was it doing there if she was still in bed? Maybe she got up to give the kitty some food? He stood up and went around the car to see what was behind it. And he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was his mother's dead body, filled with scratches all over her and a huge hole in her abdomen from which her intestines were hanging out. Javier was frozen in shock and couldn't react. However, he still looked at the cat, which purred while playing with his mother's hair. Blanche Monnier was an attractive 26-year-old woman with a pretty active social life, who was born in a wealthy French family. They were defenders of royalty back then and hated Republicans very deeply. Her father was a dean of the Faculty of Letters, and her brother gave lectures at the church. And so they had no economic troubles and lived a pretty comfortable life of abundance. One day, Blanche met an attorney who was much older than her, and he was really broke, but she couldn't help falling in love with him. However, in 1876, Blanche disappeared without a trace. Her family informed everyone about her disappearance and searched for her everywhere. Blanche's father died in 1882, and 3 years later, the poor attorney she had fallen in love with also passed away. Time passed, and it seemed that everyone had forgotten about Lady Monnier, when suddenly, someone sent a letter to a judge and the case was reopened. In the letter, they explained that a woman was being held captive in the house of the Monnier family. She was starving and had been living on garbage for the last 25 years. At first, this was shocking, since the family had an impeccable reputation. The mother, who was 75 years old now and lived with her son, had been awarded for her many contributions to the city. However, just in case, the police went to check the Monnier house. They went upstairs to the second floor and found a locked door. At first, the old woman refused to give them the key, but in the end, she had to comply with the authorities. And that's when they discovered that the message was true. When they opened the door, an unbearable stench immediately came out. And when they went inside, they found that the room was filled with garbage: meat, fish, vegetables, bread. All of it rotten. There was even excrement and vomit on the floor, surrounded by insects. And when they looked at a corner, they realized there was a malnourished woman laying on the bed, covered with a very filthy blanket. The police tried to talk to her, but the woman would only kick and scream. The mother was apprehended and ended up confessing what happened. She was very worried about her daughter Blanche being in love with a failed attorney, and so she locked her up. She would not allow her daughter to smear the honor of her family. Blanche Monnier could finally be free, but unfortunately, she went insane after spending 25 years locked up in a room. She weighed 24 kilograms and had to be interned in a psychiatric hospital for the rest of her life. She developed a lot of mental disorders, which only got worse over time. She passed away just 12 years later, all due to the mental and physical damage produced by her mother's extreme and inhumane punishment. Welcome again, horror lovers. Today, we bring you a very famous legend, the story of Veronica, a girl murdered by her own father. He was an alcoholic priest who, after learning her daughter didn't believe in God, sacrificed her by stabbing her with a knife. However, after death, Veronica's soul ended up stuck at the limbo between our world and the afterlife. And from then on, since she can't rest in peace, Veronica kills anyone who dares to summon her, using the same knife that ended her life. Her spirit is thirsty for revenge towards those who don't believe in the afterlife. Some of you might know that the number 3 is very special in Catholicism. It symbolizes the Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as well as the 3 Magi. Moreover, Jesus Christ allegedly died when he was 33 years old. Because of this, it is said that if you place 3 candles in front of a mirror and repeat her name 3 times, she will be summoned. Julia learned about this from a video recommended by YouTube's algorithm and mentioned it to her friends at school. At first, they taunted her, saying that she would never dare to do that ritual. And later on, they all ended up deciding to carry out the ritual together. They gathered all the necessary materials for the ritual, and one of Julia's more timid friends also brought a Bible from his house. He thought that with this book in his hands, Veronica wouldn't be able to hurt them. And so they went into the school's bathroom and closed the door. Then they placed the candles on the floor and lit them. Feeling nervous, they all did a countdown and then repeated in unison, "Veronica, Veronica, Veronica." Nothing happened. They waited a couple of seconds and, feeling both relieved but disappointed, decided to leave. However, when they tried to open the bathroom door, it was locked, and then they heard laughter behind them. The candles went out and they all turned around in fear. They saw a woman with pale skin and her eyes bleeding. Giving them no time to assimilate what was happening, Veronica crossed through the mirror with her knife in her hand and mercilessly killed everyone there, except for Julia, who was holding her friend's Bible in her hands. Veronica then disappeared and the bathroom door burst open. And when Julia rushed out of there, the Bible she had started to burn. When Julia arrived home, she locked herself in her room. She couldn't tell this to anyone. All of her friends had died because of her. The bodies were found hours later when a janitor went into the school's bathroom. The families of the victims were deeply affected, and journalists were piling up at the school's entrance. She went to the bathroom to wash her face and see if maybe everything that happened was just a bad dream. However, as she entered the bathroom, she found her mirror covered in blood with an inscription saying, "It's me, Veronica. You should have never summoned me."
Smith was the only butcher in a small town in Spain. He came from England when he was little because his father was offered a job in that town. He grew up along the other kids in the town and developed good friendships over the years. And for this reason, when he grew up and opened his own butcher shop, he always had customers. They preferred to spend their money in his business instead of going to the supermarket. Anyone who knew Smith would describe him as the perfect person, except for one particular defect: his unhealthy obsession with money. Bills and coins were his drug, to the point that if he earned one less euro than expected on a particular day, he would get depressed. He married 12 years ago, and 10 years ago is when his son was born, who had helped Smith at the butcher shop since he was little. The business then started doing badly for a few months. The meat Smith was selling tasted terrible, and thus only his closest friends were making the sacrifice of buying meat there. Smith's previous supplier went bankrupt, and so he had to look for a different one. Then one morning, while organizing the counter, he heard a devastating scream inside the shop. When Smith arrived, he found that his son had slipped while grinding up meat. Part of his arm ended up in the machine, and there was blood everywhere. After bandaging him and placing ice on his wound, he called his wife and an ambulance so they would take his son to the city's hospital. Smith couldn't go, because if he were to close that day, his family wouldn't have enough to eat for the rest of the month. All Smith could do was pray and hope his son wouldn't bleed to death. However, as he prayed, Smith had an idea. He decided he couldn't let all that meat go to waste, so he prepared it to sell it. He cried as he made burger patties with ground pork and chunks of his son's arm, but he had no other option. He placed the patties in the counter and waited for the first customer to arrive. Smith then closed the shop to have lunch, and once he reopened it, an avalanche of people came in, who compulsively bought all his remaining patties. It seems that the morning buyers said those were the best burgers they've ever tasted. Smith's demeanor changed after seeing so much money now in his hands. He remembered that he still had part of that mix of grounded pork and human flesh in the freezer, and repeated the experiment the next day. And it was so successful that even people from the neighboring town came to try out his burgers. However, Smith soon ran out of his special mix and needed more. He had made so much money in 2 days that if he kept going, he would soon be rich. Smith talked with his wife and explained to her what happened. And since she was also obsessed with money, they planned to kidnap children and grind them to make and sell those special burger patties. And so, that's what they did over the following weeks. They would kidnap children from remote places at night and would shove them in their grinder to keep making and selling their horrible but delicious product. And a few months later, that small butcher shop became so famous that it was turned into a restaurant. However, for the murderous couple, just having one single restaurant was no longer enough, since the customers would spend hours waiting to have a seat. And so they opened another restaurant, and over time opened another. And thus that modest butcher shop ended up becoming a huge fast food chain. And the customers, they still don't know what is the secret formula.
From 50,000 twins, 2 are born with a part of their bodies conjoined, and Chloe and Amy were part of that small number. Doctors said they could not be separated since they shared too many vital organs. And since their father didn't want to have a freak show at home as his descendant, and neither did he want people giving him weird looks when walking on the streets with his daughters, he decided to lock them up in the basement for 9 long years. He would throw them food from the basement door as if they were a beast without feelings. And so, one day, the girls decided to escape. They waited for dinner time, and once their father opened the basement door, they rushed towards it. This resulted in their father pushing them down the stairs, following with insults towards them. The girls were desperate. What did they do to deserve this hellish abuse? On their 9th birthday, their father said, "I have a special gift for you. Tomorrow, you're out of here." They felt overjoyed and spent the night imagining what the outside world must be like. However, the worst was yet to come. First, their father forced them to put on handcuffs and muzzles. Then he pushed them into a box and sealed the box with duct tape. The girls were in the box for a long time, not knowing where their father was taking them. Hours later, a knife suddenly pierced the box, and a ray of light showed the girls that the time to see the outside world had finally come. However, when they came out of the box, they realized they weren't going to be free. They were locked inside a cage, and on the other side was a man dressed in a white coat and writing something down in a notebook. He then approached the girls and removed their muzzles. They immediately cried for help, but that just made the man laugh. He ordered them to calm down and explained that he was a scientist. He said he was going to perform a few experiments on them and promised to let them go if they survived. The man then took out a needle and pricked Amy to check if Chloe also felt pain. The scientist then brought a vat filled with water and ice and shoved Chloe inside. He was trying to see if the body temperature of Amy changed along with Chloe's. And Chloe wouldn't stop screaming in pain. "Get me out of here! Get me out of here, please!" After a week of many different tests, the man said it was time to separate them. And even though they refused, he cornered them and injected them with a syringe. The sisters fell into a deep slumber. And once they woke up, they were chained to a huge table, seeing a sharp chainsaw getting closer to them. There was blood everywhere. Amy woke up in a hospital after being in a coma for months. Only she survived, since their heart was on her side of their body. How are you doing, horror lovers? Today, we bring you a terrifying legend from El Salvador, the story of La Descarnada. Many have affirmed to have seen this being, and today we'll share with you her story. In a town lived a renowned warrior and his wife. She was sterile, so she couldn't have children with her husband, and due to the customs and beliefs at the time, she was despised by the community and they wanted her to be banished. However, despite those intolerant traditions, the warrior used his influence so she could keep living in the town. Then one day, the warrior was called to fight in a war and had to leave his wife alone. And shortly after, the wife noticed that she was actually pregnant. She wanted to tell her husband the great news and wrote him a letter. On the way to send it, many women who hated the wife for being infertile surrounded her and beat her up so badly that she ended up losing the baby. Humiliated and moribund, she looked at the sky and begged the gods to help her take revenge. And thus, the gods granted her the power to remove her skin at will to scare others and then go back to normal so she could blend in. She turned into an evil being who would seduce men and then scare them to death. This way, she managed to end the life of all the children of those women who hurt her so badly, making them go insane and feel the pain she felt herself. Many of those women ended up taking their own lives after that horrible tragedy. After some time, the warrior came back home and found that his wife had changed completely. She was no longer the innocent and joyful woman he had said goodbye to. Now she was constantly surrounded by a disturbing darkness. Then one night, the warrior saw her removing her own skin and transforming into that grotesque creature that looked more like a zombie. This horrified the warrior, who decided to throw salt to her skin so it could never close again. And the salt produced such an intense pain in the woman that she screamed in agony until she finally died for good. From then on, she was known as the Flayed Woman. Her spirit was sentenced to wander around the world of the living for all of eternity. And the legend says that to this day, the Flayed Woman keeps seducing men and making them fall into her traps. "Am I going to die, doctor?" David asked me as they put him in the operation room. The boy, just 10 years old, had been crushed in a terrible car accident. The anesthetist proceeded to put him to sleep. Once we started the operation, we saw that there was hardly any chance of him resisting. Despite this, we put all our efforts into saving his life, but after half an hour, his heart stopped. My colleagues told me that his father had also died in the accident. A disgrace. I proceeded to stitch his open abdomen to take him to the morgue, and just as I put the needle through, his body trembled. I withdrew my hand, wondering what had caused that post-mortem spasm. But suddenly, the boy gasped, and as if it were a horror movie, he opened his eyes and uttered a piercing cry. I stumbled back in fright, and I quickly asked the whole team for help. Those who were leaving the room ran back in, all looking panicked at the sight of the boy they had left for dead, screaming on the operating table. The anesthetist tried to put him back into sedation. The pain he felt with his body open had to be horrible. But none of us could believe it when we saw on the monitors that his heart hadn't started beating again. He would have to be dead, but he was alive with his heart stopping. I started doing chest compressions. His ribs creaked under my hands and the anesthesia wasn't working. What is happening to me?" The boy, still conscious, stammered. None of us responded. Nobody knew what to say. We had faced many challenges in our career, but never anything like this. I took a deep breath and tried to maintain my composure. "You had an accident, David." The anesthetist grabbed my shoulder and whispered in my ear that we should isolate the operating room, that this could be contagious. While they called security from the prep room, the kid kept asking me questions. He asked me about his father. I couldn't lie to him. I had to tell him that he had died. Then he started sobbing and asked me if he was dying too. A river of tears fell down my face. I shook his hand and told him, "You are not alone. I will stay with you until the end." The Center for Disease Control had been alerted to our situation. There was nothing we could do but hope and pray that it wasn't contagious. The boy was in a lot of pain, and I could only keep him distracted. Hours later, the prevention team arrived, fully equipped in their suits. They had evacuated another room for all the doctors that were there, but I decided to stay where the little one was. No one should have to suffer alone, especially with all those people doing hundreds of tests. "Doctor, I can't see," David yelled. I examined his pupils and found that they didn't respond. "I'm very afraid." I stayed by his side. I told him that everything was fine, but each time he yelled at me more as if he didn't hear me. Within minutes, he lost his hearing. He had gone deaf and blind. I could no longer communicate with him. I wanted to comfort him, tell him that I would stay with him, not to be afraid. I could not stop crying. The prevention agents decided that my presence had become unnecessary. David wouldn't stop crying. No, I promised that I would stay with him. Suddenly, the little boy stopped screaming. Did he die? I demanded that they inform me of their condition, and they told me that the only organ that was still active was the brain. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't hear, but he was still in excruciating pain. They covered him with an airtight capsule, and I never saw him again. When my quarantine ended, I contacted a friend who worked on the prevention team and had no record of David's case. Days later, a lawyer and a doctor showed up at my house. They told me what I had been infected with, and I had to sign a confidentiality document. They gave me an injection, but it wasn't a cure. It would only prevent me from spreading that disease. My end will be just like that of little David. I just hope someone sticks with me when it happens. The Suarez family loved each other a lot. The parents worked hard to make Hugo and Maria happy, 8-year-old twins. Since they were born, they didn't make plans without them. They weren't one of those parents who needed to spend moments with their friends. They were happy in the tranquility of their home. They lived in a mansion. The work of Meredith, the mother, had brought them many economic benefits. She was the director of a multinational, and she had managed to reconcile her work with her family very well. Most of the afternoons, she worked from home while her children did their homework. But sometimes she had big acts away from home. Normally, she went alone, but this time she was going to receive an important award, so her husband didn't hesitate to accompany her. They didn't know very well what to do with the children because taking them was totally unfeasible because they had a school. So they asked their 20-year-old niece to stay with them. Also, Meredith's mother would take care of the children too, who was 60 years old. The 4 of them stayed home very happy, and the children with those caregivers were very calm. At home, when they finished their homework, they prepared dinner together, brushed their teeth, and after a short story, the children fell asleep in their beds. The grandmother was tired too, so she went to bed and the niece began to watch a series in the living room. She was totally absorbed in the episode when the phone rang. She quickly picked up and said, "Hello?" But on the other side, she only heard a strange gasp and laughter. She was thinking it was a phone prank, and she quickly hung up the phone. She returned to the series, but just a few seconds later, the phone rang again. She took it again with her hand and said, "Hello?" And on the other side, she heard a man's voice that said, "Have you gone upstairs to see the children?" She was still convinced that it was a joke. "This isn't funny!" And she hung up the phone. She was leaving the phone on the stand when the phone rang for the 3rd time. This time, she didn't answer. She just listened. "Since you haven't gone up to see the children, I have taken care of them. Now I'm going to get you." She got very scared with the last call. So before going upstairs to see that everything was correct, she decided to call the police. She found and denounced the threats that she was suffering. The police asked her that if the man called again, she would distract him. In this way, they would have time to identify the call. And she didn't have to wait long. After a few seconds, the ringing of the phone made her nervous again. Before he began to speak, she tried to distract him with pleading and crying. She asked him to please leave her alone, that the children didn't deserve anything bad. She tried to tell him a story about his family, but the man ended up hanging up. But immediately the phone rang again. She thought it was the same person again, but this time the police were calling. They told her, "Get out of the house immediately. We've been able to locate the calls and they come from upstairs." She couldn't believe what she was hearing, but she could only think of her little nephew and niece and their parents who had entrusted their care to her. So without hesitation, she went upstairs to save the children. The police entered the house 23 minutes later and found 4 completely unrecognizable bodies. Welcome back, horror lovers.
We hope you're doing well, and we hope you're also prepared for today's dose of terror. There's a place where all abandoned toys end up, and it's not the garbage. Someone rescues them from the landfills and takes them to a secret place. There, they meet all kinds of discarded toys and live a happy existence together. However, some toys never forget how they were replaced and thrown to the garbage after providing fun for children for so many years. And the worst part is when their owners grow up and completely forget about them. That was the case of Kirsty and Ronan, a couple who had been together since they were built. They were exclusive toys built by hand by a great artisan. Their creation was done with so much love that their beauty and their colorful hair were admired by all the children who passed by that toy store. However, they were pretty expensive, and since they were made as a couple, were not being sold separately. After they arrived at that haven of abandoned toys, they sunk into a deep depression and started having serious marital problems. They were obsessed about those moments of joy when they played with the girl they thought were their best friend. That's why Ronan, with his heart filled with pain and anger, wanted to take revenge. Kirsty felt the same way. Hatred, a feeling which can be as strong as love, corrupted them, and they started to grow in size until they were as tall as an average human. With their newfound size, then they headed to the city's downtown where they were originally built. People were stopping them and asking them to please take photos with them, amazed at how realistic their costumes looked. Guided by the connection they still had with their former owner, they managed to find her house. She was now an adult, was married, and had children of her own. Kirsty and Ronan grabbed each other's hand and knocked on the door. It was her who opened it, and her jaw dropped when she immediately recognized them. The dolls then cruelly tackled her and tore out her skull with their bare hands. They were then seen walking around holding the head of their former owner, covered in blood and with an evil smirk on their faces. The neighbors called the police, but as much as the agents shot them and pierced their bodies, the dolls kept on walking as if nothing happened. They then went into the toy store where they were originally sold, and the artisan who made them immediately recognized them too. He couldn't understand how it was possible for them to have grown to such a size. And then, the overgrown dolls proceeded to murder in cold blood all of the families in the toy store. Christmas was just a few days away, so the store was packed that day. After the carnage, the dolls kept walking while holding each other's arm. She held the head of their creator in her hand, while he held the head of their former owner in his hand. And as they walked, they kept holding that same cruel, evil, and terrifying smirk. How are ya, horror lovers? Today, we tell you the story of a young woman who walked every night in her wedding dress and a long veil covering her face. She always walked with her doll, which was special because it had the body of an ordinary doll in the shape of a baby, but the head of a pig. Everyone in the village saw her walking among the trees, rustling the leaves. She always made the same route and with her head lowered. The neighbors wondered what had brought her to this situation of depression and madness. Some launched theories about a breakup with her partner and he had left her standing at the altar. Others said that it was something more serious, like the death of her future husband. And that was why she always went out with the wedding dress that she never wore. However, the most striking was the affection and delicacy with which she treated her doll. She carried it on her lap, cooing at it, as if it were her baby and alive. Everyone saw the pig's head on the toy. Otherwise, they would surely think it was their son. For this reason, other neighbors argued that the reason for her disorder couldn't be other than the loss of a child. They all thought they knew the truth about her, but no one spoke to her. They were used to seeing her walking daily, but there was something about her that caused them fear. If she had a serious personality disorder like schizophrenia, she might react in a violent way. So everyone avoided her and looked at her from afar. On the other hand, boys sometimes bet on who was able to get closer to the bride without fear, to prove their bravery. One day, one of these boys wanted to prove that he was the bravest of the group and claimed that he would not only approach her, but would dare to talk to her. All the friends put some of their toys in case the boy got what he promised, and they hid among the trees to watch him. The young man stayed in the middle of the road, waiting for the woman to appear. When she came wandering in, he swallowed hard and asked in an impertinent tone, "Hey, why do you always take out that hideous doll with a pig's head? It's awful. You know it's not alive, right?" The woman slowed her pace and fell silent. Suddenly, a nasal and childish voice answered the young man's question. "I am the one who takes her out for a walk, and it is she who is not alive." Then the veil and the dress collapsed to the ground, showing that there was no one under the cloth. The pig-headed doll cried sadly, lying on the ground, while the boy ran after his friends. Everyone was screaming in fear after what their eyes had witnessed. Jenny was a 13-year-old girl. She was very excited because for the first time the circus had come to her town. She had never visited one, so she tried in every way possible to convince her parents to take her. Her family was humble and she didn't have enough savings to pay for 3 tickets. But Jenny was so excited that she used the money she had saved from her birthdays to pay half the price, and the other half her parents would put up to make her happy. That day in the morning, she was so happy that she told the news to all her classmates. Many told her that they would meet there because their parents would also take them. However, one of her best friends, Tom, pouted and told her that he had to talk to her alone. The young man had heard horrible rumors about that circus in nearby towns. Jenny thought he was just jealous that she could go and he couldn't, but she asked what those rumors were about. Tom told her that in the back of the circus, the actors kidnapped children and did horrible things to them. Jenny frowned. She didn't believe anything. When she asked what kind of things it was, the boy told her that he didn't know anything else, only that it was a very dangerous place. Jenny angrily accused him of trying to scare her. The boy, annoyed by her reaction, turned around and left without saying another word. Jenny wasn't going to let her friend spoil her happiness for the day, so when it was time to get out of school, she ran home to get ready for the circus show. The tent was installed in the village forest. Jenny arrived with her parents half an hour before the show, but there was already a long line of people at the box office buying their tickets. While her parents waited for their turn, the young woman approached the side of the tent where she saw several actors pass by who were practicing part of the show. Very excited, she couldn't help herself and went after them. One of the artists realized that the girl was following them, and when his companions were confused, he backed away and approached her stealthily. He told her to get away from there. That was a dangerous place. The actor asked her to return to her parents' side and ran back to his companions. Jenny remembered what her friend Tom had told her at school, so she decided to go back to the entrance. However, when she was walking back, one of the actors got in her way. He asked her where she was going and if she wanted to see some of the animals they kept in their cages. The young woman looked at him with wide eyes and excitedly replied that she would love to see the lion and tiger up close. The actor shook her hand and invited her to enter the tent. Jenny felt that what she was doing was wrong. If her parents didn't find her, they would be distraught. She asked the artist to let her out, but he gripped her hand tighter. The young woman could perceive a rotten smell. In that place, there were many cages, but no animals. She approached one of them and she could see that they were full of human corpses. She started to run towards the exit, but an acrobat with a macabre smile stopped her, tying her up and covering her eyes with a white band. Right after, shouts were heard inside the tent, and the public that was outside in line began to applaud, believing that it was part of the show to create expectation of what they were going to find there. The acrobat put his lips to Jenny's ears and said in a raspy voice, "This is the place that will make you belong to the circus forever. Deformed diva."
How are you, horror lovers? Today we tell you the legend of Aurora Simons, an American woman who at the age of 30 became pregnant. At first she couldn't contain her joy. She was very excited to know that she would soon be a mother. However, a few weeks later, she began to feel unwell and weak. She thought that it was normal, because the first months of the trimester could cause quite a bit of discomfort, but soon the situation became totally horrifying. It cost her a lot to confess it to her family, but she had no other option than to reveal that her baby was tormenting her. She claimed that the fetus spoke to her, caused her severe pain, and that she had threatened to take her life if she mentioned his existence. The family tried to reassure her by telling her that they were just imagining, the result of stress, exhaustion, and fear. The best thing she could do was stay calm, be relaxed, and wait for the months to pass, because each time the discomfort would get less. Aurora reproached them for no one believing her. Every day she was more scared and desperate. She was screaming for help, to get that baby out of her, that he was causing her unbearable pain. After speaking with psychologists who diagnosed that her mind was playing tricks on her, the woman continued to affirm that she felt that she was dying because this pain wasn't normal. So her family decided to take her to a hospital to check and see if the child was okay. Unfortunately, Aurora lost her life on the way, a little before reaching the center. Doctors tried to revive her, but both she and the baby had died. After several tests, they discovered that all of Aurora's organs were chewed up, as if a rat was gnawing each of them to pieces. That woman had spent weeks imploring them to remove that devil from her insides, which consumed her, threatened her, and tortured her. The doctors refused to believe all those statements, but they found no explanation for the supernatural event. Brian was only 6 years old when he was hospitalized for a problem with his little heart. It was very sad to walk through the corridor where several children, instead of being able to play in the park, were locked up between 4 walls connected to various machines in order to continue breathing. The sanitarians went out of their way to make them happy every day, so the head nurse Alan had an idea. He encouraged his coworkers to dress up as clowns, complete with colorful costumes, wigs, and makeup. In this way, through laughter therapy, they would help all the children in the hospital. In the afternoon, the nurses got dressed and went into different rooms to make the little ones laugh. The head nurse got Brian's room. When the boy heard the sound of the door opening, he jumped out of bed thinking it was his parents. However, when he found himself face to face with the clown, fear seized him, screaming desperately. Alan, wanting to calm the little boy down, approached him and tried to explain that it was just a costume, that he shouldn't be afraid. But the boy was so horrified that he ran to the window, tearing the intravenous line out of his arm with the movement. The head nurse threw himself at him with all his might to go grab him, but the boy, feeling attacked, threw himself out the window, emitting one last deafening scream. The fall from the 5th floor had been deadly. The screams and noises had been heard from everywhere. When other nurses entered the room, they found Alan frozen, staring out the window, and the child's slippers next to the window. The nurse didn't sleep that night, nor would he sleep the following nights. In his mind, he relived the tragic event over and over again. The next day, the news was in all the newspapers in the city, in which he was blamed for the death of little Brian. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the most unrecognizable body of the boy when he was picked up. Weeks later, the nurse on his floor, dressed up as a clown again. Afterwards, he grabbed a bottle and threw it against the wall, breaking it into several pieces. With one of the crystals, the finger was cut, and with the blood that dripped from his hand, he wrote a text on the wall that said, "I killed the boy, and also the clown." Then he jumped out the window of his 5th floor.
John and his sister Kate had arrived at the summer camp. She didn't want to stay there, but her parents had convinced her by offering to go to the amusement park when she got home. The siblings, aged 12 and 14, felt old enough to be left alone, giving them the impression that their parents were giving them a babysitter. Upon arrival, the siblings had to leave their bags in different places. The boys slept in one area and the girls in another. As the days passed, John's impression of the camp had changed a lot. There were not only small children, but also many boys his age and older. The monitors were young, and every day they carried out very fun activities in nature. The young man fit in very well with the group with whom he shared a room. They always played the games on the same team. One of his friends introduced him to Tracy. That girl was without a doubt the most fascinating young woman he had ever met. It was a crush at first sight. She was intelligent, adventurous, funny, kind. All the adjectives fell short. And luckily, Tracy thought the same about him, so they soon became a couple and they didn't separate all day. In all that time, Kate didn't want to participate in any activity. She always said that she was tired and she didn't feel like it. Although her brother thought she was only behaving this way because she didn't like the place and hadn't been able to connect with any of her peers. However, Kate began to lose a lot of weight, so much so that in 1 week it seemed that she had lost 8 kilos. She was very pale and she hardly ate. John got angry with her and told her that she had to eat, otherwise she would end up really sick. But Kate seemed gone. She was very strange. The young man felt guilty for having left her aside because of his relationship with Tracy. He had made his sister feel lonely and sad, so he tried to spend more time with her. That was when he realized that Kate was not pretending. Something must have happened to her because the next day she asked the doctor to see her. The monitor informed her parents that their daughter would be seen by a medic and he would tell her whether she should go home or not. When the doctor attended the young woman, he stated that she was like this due to malnutrition because she herself had decided not to eat. She did not have any disease, she just wanted to leave because she was not comfortable in that place. Therefore, the monitors tried to encourage her to socialize with her peers and to get involved in the activities. However, each day Kate consumed more and more. John, determined to find an explanation, sneaked into the girl's room while everyone was having breakfast. He checked his sister's backpack in case she had something hidden, and he even checked her bed. And suddenly, there was something that caught his attention. On the pillowcase, there were some small dark spots. It looked like dried blood. He wanted to get a better look at it and noticed that it weighed a lot, too much to be just a pillow. He took a pair of scissors and cut the cover. The top feathers flew and suddenly John released the pillow from his hands with a cry. At the bottom, in the middle of the feathers, there was a monstrous animal with hairy legs. It looked like a giant tick. It was so swollen it looked like it was going to burst. Night after night since Kate had arrived, this creature had plunged its trunk into her temple, sucking her blood. The wound was so fine and small that on the head it was almost imperceptible. For days, it had consumed her sister. Could you have a bug like this under your pillow?
James was dead. His wife Sarah and their children, dressed in black, gave him their last goodbye by throwing a red rose on top of the funeral box. When Sarah got home, she kicked off her heels, showered, made herself a coffee, and covered herself with a blanket on the couch. Suddenly, her mobile phone rang. On the screen was the number of her deceased husband, James. She picked up the call and listened. "Sarah, honey, you have to help me. I don't have much time." She asked in a strange voice, "Who was it?" To which her husband replied in a weak voice, "Sarah, it's me, James. I don't have much air left. They buried me. They buried me alive." "What James?" she asked. "What James? I'm your husband. Please, you have to come save me. It's very cold and I'm running out of oxygen." Sarah froze for a moment, but she pulled herself together and told her husband that she would call one of her sons to help him. He had to stay calm and not hang up, so she would know he was alive at all times. Her husband, his voice weakening, told her that he didn't remember how he got there. He only remembered dining at home alone with her. She had prepared a delicious stew for him, and the wine was spectacular. He had never tasted anything like it. Sarah hadn't eaten a bite, settling for a small piece of bread and a glass of water. She smiled and enjoyed watching him eat. She knew he was loving it. "Oh, Sarah, you've always been so good to me, even though I've disrespected you so many times. Now I understand that you were always the woman I deserved. Good housewife, cook, you always had my clothes clean and ready. You put up with my anger, my bad mood. You've always been there, until the end." Sarah stared at nothing as she sipped her coffee. Then she answered with a cold voice, "Don't you think it's strange that they buried you with a cell phone?" James was silent. He didn't understand anything. It was true that there was no point in burying a corpse with a cell phone. Sarah drank the entire contents of her cup in one last sip, wiped her mouth and said, "I wanted to be the last to hear your cries after poisoning you and pretending to be dead. I wanted to hear how you writhed in your grave. I just wanted to be your last call."
How are ya, horror lovers? Today we bring you a Colombian horror legend, the Patetarro. It is a giant, ugly, hairy, and dirty being that lives in the mountains and mining areas of Antioquia, Chocó, and Cundinamarca, among other regions of Colombia. It is said that in life, the Patetarro was a womanizing man with a bad character who used to be involved in fights. These disputes used to be so violent that the protagonist came to use machetes. One day, during one of them, he ended up seriously injured in one of his legs. He took refuge in a cave in an old mine, but his injury got so bad and he had to cut off his limb. He replaced it with a guadua stick with the shape of a jar, and he began to use the stick to deposit his excrements. The man died in the mine. However, his soul in pain was wandering in the area. People who have seen him describe him as a giant that drags the wadua jar on its leg, giving off a fetid odor. When the jar is full of droppings, it spills them on the ground, creating worms and all kinds of pests. If these debris fall on top of any plant or crop, they destroy them very quickly. In addition, while walking, he sometimes leaves a trail of white liquid on the ground, and when it appears, it heralds misfortunes such as the death of someone nearby or floods. When he finishes doing his evil deeds, he screams and laughs with loud and ghoulish laughter, scaring everyone who hears him. He usually appears especially on rainy and dark nights. The legend says that if the dogs howl for no reason and the trees move very strongly, they are announcing that this creature is near. In other versions, it is said that the patetaro was a thief who used to steal chickens and that in one of those robberies, he was surprised by the owners. They chased him while shooting, believing he was a wild animal. When he ran away, he put his foot in a bucket of manure, and as a result of that incident, as revenge, he appears in the fields and ruins the crops of ranchers and farmers. He spreads all his excrement over the crops so that they rot, leaving pestilence and death in his wake. Nothing blooms, animals are poisoned, and all vegetation decomposes where he passes. Although in almost all the texts they present him as a man, in some regions they describe this being with a feminine gender. According to the author Ivan Salazar Duque, the patetaro, whom for him is a feminine creature, is represented as a being with a face between feminoid and bestial, covered in leaves with messy hair, pointed fangs, and deformed nails. Did you know this legend, TikTakers? How are you, horror lovers? Today, we bring you a legend from the province of Pontevedra, Spain. There, we find a cemetery in the small town of Mondariz, which has terrified several generations. Juan Luis had gone on vacation to Pontevedra with several friends. The first days were dedicated to seeing the city center, and then they decided to visit the small towns in the surroundings. Thus, they arrived in Mondariz and stayed in a hotel located in the vicinity of a forest. One of his friends wanted to go out at night to visit the woods. Although the rest didn't feel like it much, they accompanied him down the park path. After walking for a kilometer, they arrived at a cemetery. It had a very tall gate with iron gates. The group of friends decided to go in to browse. The cemetery seemed to be abandoned. The grass was untended and there were half-open graves. After making a detour, they left the place and found a man running terrified. Seeing them, he told them to hide very well, because if they didn't, they would die. The boys laughed at the man and he disappeared into the darkness. They continued on their way when suddenly they heard a kind of murmuring. Shortly after, they saw a glow approaching them and heard footsteps. Juan Luis and his friends looked at each other and scared, they ran to the cemetery again to hide. They didn't want to look at what or who they were. They stood quietly behind a wall as they felt a group of people walk past them. At that moment, it began to smell very strongly of burning. The group remained completely still and silent until little by little the footsteps receded. When they no longer heard anything, they came out of their hiding place and saw footprints on the damp ground. The trail of footsteps followed the same direction that the man who had run away had taken. Juan Luis and his friends left the forest and returned to the hotel. When they entered, there was an old man at the reception who, seeing them, yelled at them, asking them to explain why they had gone out into the woods at night. After telling them what happened, the man began to pray for them. He told them that at night, in the Galician mountains, and especially with a full moon, you can find the Santa Compaña. If someone crosses this group of hooded persons, they will give him a burning bone as a torch to wander with them for the rest of eternity. You cannot look at them. If someone dares to do so,
He must draw a circle on the ground and stay inside until they pass by. And whoever doesn't dare to look at them, he must hide very well and pray that they don't see him. In Mondariz Cemetery, only the victims of the Santa Compaña were buried. It is said that these souls are cursed, which is why the place is hidden away from the town. Juan Luis asked the old man about the footsteps they had heard, to which the man replied that it could be the steps of the Santa Compaña. The group of friends never knew what happened that night, but the man who ran away next to the cemetery never returned to town. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. And if you want to see more Draw My Life videos, subscribe to our channel. See you in the next episode!